Former President Jimmy Carter appeared to get North Korea, as well as the international community, to step back from the brink of war this week. But not everyone is waiting to see if all the talk on ending the standoff over North Korea's nuclear ambitions brings action. CNN's Joe Oliver reports.
Early in the week, the tension reached a peak as South Korea held air raid and civil defense drills. North Korea withdrew its membership in the International Atomic Energy Agency on Monday, and the U.S. drew up a draft United Nations sanctions resolution against North Korea. The distance between North Korea and the United States seemed a chasm.
At this point, it is entirely up to North Korea to defuse the situation.
The solution entirely depends on the United States.
Into the Gulf stepped Jimmy Carter.
I would like to take this opportunity to pass to the Korean People's Army and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, President Carter, his wife, and their party for your safekeeping.
He walked across the demilitarized zone on Wednesday to become one of the highest-ranking Americans ever to visit North Korea. His discussion centered on North Korea's nuclear program. The West fears the North is taking plutonium from its nuclear power plant to make bombs. North Korea denies it, but has refused full access to international monitors that could verify the claim. And the IAEA says the North has removed fuel rods from the reactor, effectively destroying evidence of any past plutonium diversion. Some analysts believe the North Koreans are determined to build a bomb to secure themselves against what they see is an increasingly hostile world. Others believe the North Koreans are only using the nuclear issue as a bargaining chip in gaining full diplomatic recognition from the United States. CNN's Mike Chinoy covered Mr. Carter's visit.
If there's a lesson, and President Carter said this explicitly in his statement to CNN, it is that talking to the North Koreans, giving them respect, treating them on an equal footing may be the way to prompt them to offer the concessions that President Clinton and the rest of the international community is looking for on the nuclear question.
North Korea gave Mr. Carter an extraordinarily warm welcome. He spent 3 hours Thursday with President Kim Il-sung and was treated to a sightseeing tour of a capital showing no preparations for war. Mr. Carter was invited back on Friday for a rare second session. That meeting took place on President Kim's private yacht. The North appeared eager to discuss the nuclear issue, and the Clinton administration suddenly found itself engaging in what appeared to be televised diplomacy. On Thursday, Mr. Carter announced the North wanted a resumption of high-level talks with the United States and that it had backed down from a threat to kick out Western nuclear inspectors.
He's given me assurance that as long as this good faith effort is going on between the United States and North Korea, that the inspectors will stay on site and the surveillance equipment will not be interrupted. This gives us a chance to build up confidence.
If today's developments mean that North Korea is genuinely and verifiably prepared to freeze its nuclear program while talks go on, and we hope that is the case, then we would be willing to resume high-level talks.
What Mr. Clinton did not mention was a previous U.S. condition for talks, that North Korea allow inspectors to investigate any past diversion of plutonium from the reactor. Mr. Carter's efforts appeared to falter Friday when he made a statement that surprised the media and the administration.
And would like to inform you that they have stopped the sanctions activity in the United Nations.
Mr. Carter appeared to say that the push toward sanctions had been halted, but the Clinton administration was quick to deny that assertion and said Mr. Carter was not representing official U.S. policy. Mr. Carter walked back across the DMZ Saturday, bringing a proposal for the first-ever summit between the presidents of North and South Korea. Such a summit has been proposed before and has come to nothing. And the ultimate success of Mr. Carter's trip depends on whether the promises he secured result in action or installing by the North Korean government. For Week in Review, I'm Joe Oliver.
They waited 54 years to claim rights to the coveted Stanley Cup. And on Tuesday night, the jubilant New York Rangers drank from the massive silver chalice after capturing the 1994 National Hockey League Championship. Their 3-2 win over the Vancouver Canucks in a frenzied Game 7 of the championship series was cause for celebration. It was the first time since 1940 that the Rangers have earned the national hockey title.
Held in abeyance.
Your words to Kim Il-sung, words which CNN's cameras caught, recorded, and played back, wherein I'm quoting you now. I would like to inform you that they, referring to the U.S. government, have stopped the sanctions activity in the United Nations. Did you say that?
Yes, I said that. But that was in the context of his understanding that my role was completely unofficial, and based on what I understood from my discussions all that previous night, that if the President Kim's assurances to me were carried out, that the sanctions vote would not be necessary. I went on to use the word held in abeyance and spent a good bit of time explaining to the Korean interpreters what the word abeyance means. And I think that that explanation to the White House has been satisfactory. It was an unfortunate choice of words on my part to say stopped. What I meant was, you know, held in abeyance for the time being while they investigated what I had accomplished.
In part in relation to those words, a White House official or senior U.S. official was quoted in the Washington Post, an article I know you know well, as saying, and again I'm quoting, "Carter is hearing what he wants to hear. He is creating his own reality." How does it make you feel to see remarks like that?
Well, I didn't know about that kind of reaction until I got back to Portland and was changing planes to come back to the East Coast. I was taken aback by it because I was never misled. You know, I was never putting my own words forward. But I don't know who in the White House may have said it or who in the administration may have said. No one this morning knows who might have said things like that. The point is, there was an inability for us to communicate clearly, you know, on an open line from Pyongyang in the middle of the night. And I think everybody should have waited a day or two and let me get back to Washington and give them a thorough briefing before commenting. But all that's over now. I think I can report to you that my sessions this morning with our chief negotiator and with the National Security Advisor, and also extensively with President Clinton on the phone, have been completely satisfactory, and I'm very, very pleased.
Well,
Mr. President, you know, there will be critics who will argue that the North Koreans are simply stalling, that they're going to use this opportunity to go ahead and develop a nuclear bomb, and they're using you in effect. What do you say to those critics?
Well, if they should proceed to use any of the presently spent fuel rods for making a nuclear bomb, it would be very apparent to the international inspectors who are there. And a violation of this agreement that's been worked out through me would be an extremely serious case and proving that the North Koreans are liars and that they are not going to carry out the word of what they call the great leader, President Kim Il-sung. I would be very surprised if they didn't carry out the promises or commitments made to me, and if they don't carry them out, this will be easily observed.
Well, the next step, as I understand it, is for the United States and North Korea to have what's called this third round of high-level talks.
Yes.
And during this third round, the North Koreans would promise to freeze their nuclear program. Is that the understanding that you have?
No, as a matter of fact, President Kim Il-sung has already promised to freeze the nuclear program during the conduct of the third round talks. And that means that they will not do anything, say, to reprocess the spent fuel rods that have been in question. In the meantime, there's no doubt about the fact that he is committed, and the whole North Korean government is committed to keeping the international inspectors on site and keeping the surveillance equipment operating so that anybody can tell what they are doing with the spent
So when does the third round begin?
I would hope very soon. I would guess the only prerequisite to holding the third round is for there to be official confirmation that what I have worked out in my private citizen's role is indeed an accurate report.
When you say pretty soon, days, weeks,
I would hope so. I would think that tomorrow morning.
You think they're going to begin tomorrow morning?
No, the process will begin to confirm the agreement that I've reported to be accurate and binding on the North Korean government. And as soon as that is done, I guess the next arrangement would be made for the third round of talks to commence probably in Geneva, since that's about halfway between Pyongyang and Washington.
And these talks would be with Robert Gallucci on the U.S. side and his counterpart on the North Korean side?
It's Vice Minister Kang, K-A-N-G, Kang.
So we should expect, based on your conversations both with the North Koreans and the White House, to see conversations, probably in Geneva, between Mr. Gallucci and Mr. Kang within the next several weeks.
Oh, I would hope, yes.
Or sooner.
Hopefully sooner.
Do you believe Kim Il-sung? Do you trust him?
Well, it's not a matter of trust. The point is that everything he told me will soon be subject to proof by the actions carried out or the decisions made in the bilateral talks. I believe that he will honor all the commitments he made to me, yes.
Mr. President, we have to take a break. When we come back, we want to ask you just how close you feel the United States and Korea may have come to war. We'll continue our conversation with former President Jimmy Carter right after this.
Soon, a new voice will be heard across the land. Yours.
Here's how people use News Radio 740, KTRH.
KTRH keeps me informed. When I want to know what's going on in the world, I listen to AM 740.
I switched to AM 740 to get the news I need, and KTRH AccuWeather forecasts, they're always on target.
I don't get enough info on my music station. For news, traffic, and weather, I use AM 740, KTRH.
Give us 30 minutes, and we'll give you the world. News Radio 740, KTRH.
Police Academy, the most explosive, the most exciting stunt show in the world, comes to Six Flags in Houston. Six Flags Astro World. This summer only. All the kicks, all the thrills of the hilarious Warner Brothers Police Academy movies explode live at Six Flags Astro World. The Police Academy stunt show, direct from Hollywood. Don't miss a single explosive minute. A show this exciting should be against the law. Six Flags Astro World. A world of fun, not a world away.
No matter how you say bedroom, this says it all. A Sealy Posturepedic costs about 3 times what a complete Superior waterbed costs. And you'll have to replace the Sealy several times, while your Superior waterbed will last forever. A Superior waterbed makes sense, and dollars, too.
Now showing on Warner Home Theater.
Once is not enough. See the chase again on pay-per-view. Harrison Ford and Tommy Lee Jones in The Fugitive.
Go get him!
Critics say The Fugitive is full of suspense, thrills, fun. It's dynamite.
Put that gun down!
And Gene Siskel says, I've already seen it twice. I'll probably see it again. Harrison Ford is The Fugitive.
This is CNN.
A note to our viewers, Money Week, which is normally shown at this time, will not be seen this week so that we may continue our special conversation with former President Jimmy Carter, who is just back from North and South Korea, having held history-making meetings there. Joining me in the questioning, Mr. Carter, is our senior White House correspondent, Wolf Blitzer. Mr. President, how close to war did you fear or did you believe the situation was developing in Korea?
Well, I had no way to know, but I could see an international confrontation being inevitable.
Inevitable?
Yes, unless there was some way to communicate with the only person in North Korea who could make a decision to change the course of events. And since I had had an invitation from President Kim Il-sung since early 1991 to come to North Korea, I decided that I would ascertain whether this invitation was still in effect. And when I inquired, the North Koreans came back immediately and said, yes, it is still in effect. We'd very much like for you to come and meet with what they call the great leader, President Kim Il-sung.
So you really initiated your trip this time to North Korea. They didn't initiate it, you did.
That's correct, yes.
Because the impression that we got originally was that they had invited you to come.
Well, as I said, they've invited me several times since early 1991. In 1992, as a matter of fact, I actually sent an advance team over preparing for my trip. But just subsequent to that, everything got very rosy. They began to have direct talks between prime ministers and so forth, and it seemed that any crisis had been alleviated and there was no need for me to go. I didn't want to go just as a tourist. I wanted to be helpful.
But every time in the past when you asked permission from the administration, whether the Bush administration or the Clinton administration, they said no. This time they said yes.
Yeah, well, that's a little bit too strong a word, permission. You know, I asked for their advice on whether or not I should go, and they advised me that in their opinion I should not go. So I have always honored the inclinations of the leaders, whether it was President Bush or President Clinton.
Mr. President, walk us through a little bit. What led you to believe the situation was so urgent and deteriorating so rapidly that your personal intervention this time was warranted?
Well, not too long ago, the morning that President Clinton left to go to Europe for the 8-day visit, I think, to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Normandy landings, I called him an hour before he left on this trip. I told him that I had become increasingly concerned about the crisis in Korea, and that I couldn't quite understand what was going on, and he and I agreed that I should get a top-level and thorough briefing. So the following Sunday, which was the 5th of this month, the chief negotiator, Assistant Secretary of State Robert Gallucci, came down the plains to my home and gave me a thorough briefing, about 3 hours or more. When he finished the briefing, I was distressed to realize the seriousness of the problem, and apparently the direct conflicting commitments that existed between President Clinton on the one hand and the North Koreans on the other. And I didn't understand that there was any way for them to have communication with the only person in North Korea who could change the course of events or alleviate the misunderstandings. My wife and I discussed this that night after Bob Gallucci went back to Washington, and the next morning I decided that I should explore the possibility of going to North Korea. So that's when I inquired to the North Koreans, does my invitation still stand? They said yes. And I called Vice President Al Gore, told him I had this invitation and I was strongly inclined to go. And he promised to call President Clinton in Europe. The Vice President called me back the next morning and said President Clinton had approved my going. So I immediately began to make arrangements to leave. Friday afternoon, we had extensive briefings in Washington, and Sunday morning, a week ago, we left for, just a week ago now, we left for Korea.
If the president had said, no, don't go, would you still have gone?
I doubt it. I think I would have asked to speak to him on the phone, maybe to pursue the reasons for my eagerness to go before I completely abandoned the idea. By then, I was convinced that there was a very threatening likelihood of an actual war breaking out in Korea. And I was willing to go a little bit beyond the normal proprieties in order to pursue my goal.
Wasn't the presumption then of your conversations and your trip, the presumption that this administration was pursuing a misguided policy toward Korea that was threatening war?
No, I didn't think it was the fact that the war was threatened because of misguided policies on the part of our government.
A misguided policy could lead to war.
But I wouldn't insinuate that the policies of this government were misguided. The problem was that, as happens fairly often in international diplomacy, there was no way to provide direct or personal communication between the two leaders who could actually make a decision to change the course of events. This has been the case in many instances. I'll just give you one, and that is a standoff for decades between the PLO on the one hand and Israelis on the other. Once you provide some means to communicate, which the Norwegians did, then there's a chance for success. I provided that same sort of opportunity between Israel and Egypt at the Camp David Accords. So this happens quite often, and unfortunately, at this moment, there's no really easy way for us to communicate directly with the leaders in Pyongyang.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you believe that the policy that was being advocated so forcefully by so many in the administration, that to bring about change from North Korea, to prompt them to back down from their nuclear program, required direct and increasingly intense pressure leading to international sanctions? Do you subscribe to that?
No. I'm a little uncomfortable because I don't want to insinuate that I would have done things differently had I been in the White House. But I felt then and now that North Korea was not likely to resort to threats or international pressure or embarrassment or condemnation. that the alternative had to be something that would let them and us save face, to let us come out of this in a peaceful way, and the only way I could see was to establish some form of communication. That was my original thought. It's even more firmly embedded now in my assessment. I don't think it would have been possible for the North Koreans to accept peacefully the international branding of their government as an outlaw government, and the international branding of their leader, whom they revere, as a criminal. And I think that the vote on the sanctions in the United Nations, had it come about, would have been the key point. As far as the sanctions themselves are concerned, they were relatively insignificant as far as the North Koreans felt. Cutting off a little bit of trade, which really doesn't exist, or cutting off nuclear assistance, which really doesn't exist, is of no consequence. It's a branding of them as a criminal society that would have been, I think, the precipitation for possible war.
Mr. President, we have to take another break. When we come back, we will continue our conversation with former President Jimmy Carter. And back speaking with former President Jimmy Carter about his recent trip to North and South Korea. Wolf?
Mr. President, you spoke with President Clinton this morning for about half an hour from the White House. He was at Camp David.
Yes.
Give us a little flavor. Was he mad at you? Was he pleased with you? What was his reaction to what he heard?
Well, it's not my policy to quote, heads of state, but I can say that he was pleased. Thanked me for going, congratulated me on what had been accomplished. I look forward to pursuing the opportunities without delay, but still shares with me a realization that the commitments that have been made have to be honored in performance and not just be promises.
You threw out the idea the other day in your interview with CNN from Pyongyang that perhaps it's a good opportunity for the so-called great leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, to meet directly with President Clinton face to face. Is that a pie in the sky notion, or is there some reason to believe that that's within the realm of possibility?
Well, I think the first step should be a meeting between the leaders of North and South Korea. And on an extensive boat trip that we took down the river from Pyongyang to the sea, President Kim Il-sung said that he would like for me to relay to President Kim in South Korea, Kim Jong-sam, an invitation to have a direct meeting. Earlier, the proposal had come from South Korea. He said that these things had been proposed many times in the future, all kind of nice things the last 40 years, but nothing had ever been accomplished because they always got bogged down in the lack of communication, lack of understanding. He went into some detail to ask me what was the role of the Carter Center, why was I under what aegis I came to North Korea, what other things we had done. And when I explained it, he said he would like very much for us to act as intermediaries, if necessary. If they couldn't get together between North and South Korea, maybe we could ease the way for them to communicate. He made some other very significant, I think, historic proposals. Whether they'll be carried out, I don't know. One was that they would mutually agree to reduce the number of the military down to 100,000 on both sides. And instead of continuing his previous demand that all American troops be expelled from South Korea, he said no. He was willing for the American troops to be reduced in exactly the same proportion as the North and South Korean troops. He also said that they should totally demilitarize the DMZ zone and pull back the troops from both sides, that they should open the borders to visitation on a very limited basis at first, but expanding in the future. And he agreed without any equivocation that the North Korean and American teams could go to the burial sites of at least 3,000 Americans in North Korea to find those remains and to bring them back for delivery to their families.
From the Korean War.
On the critical issue of North Korea's nuclear program, though,
yes.
What do you think is the most significant proposal or concession or commitment that he made to you that you were able to report to the White House today?
Well, it was two or three things. One is that they would keep the inspectors and the surveillance equipment intact and not make any gap in there where there was uncertainty about what happened to the spent fuel rods. Secondly, that the spent fuel rods would be made continually available to the IAEA inspectors to try to ascertain the history of the reactor since its inception. Another one was that they would freeze, in effect, the nuclear program of North Korea during the time of the good faith talks.
But not before.
Well, they're
prior
frozen right now, and the inspectors are there, and the fuel rods are too radioactive to fool with. So this is presuming that the good faith talks go forward. In fact, we made it very clear that they would also be frozen during the time that I was making my report back to Washington, so there's no problem with that. What he wanted in return were things that I think our country also wants. One is that he shift completely from a graphite moderated reactor to a light water reactor. And surprisingly, although he's 82 years old, he was thoroughly familiar with all this. A graphite reactor can use natural uranium that comes right out of the mines of North Korea, refined. A light water reactor requires enriched uranium that must come from an outside source. Also, the graphite reactor, which they have now, has as its primary goal the production of plutonium. A light water reactor would be used for the production of electricity. So this is something that both nations want. Another thing that he wants is a clear commitment of the United States about no use of nuclear weapons against North Korea. We have to realize that it's a very closed society. They're very suspicious of the outside world, and they know that we've got several thousand nuclear weapons, and they would like some official declaration of no use of nuclear weapons, and he would like to expand that to a denuclearization completely of the entire Korean area.
You know, I've heard you speak about Kim Il-sung. We have this notion of him as someone who is perhaps the least understood leader in the world. But you got to know him a little bit during the past few days. What's incorrect about this prevailing assumption that we have of him as a tyrant, dictator, a thug, if you will?
Well, I'm not going to analyze his character of what has been done in the past, but I can tell you that he is vigorous, he's intelligent, he's obviously in charge. His ministers respect him, but they have a very free discussion between him and his advisors. He seems to be, at this moment at least, quite flexible in proposing things that are unprecedented in alleviating the problems with, say, South Korea. I think that he also is revered by his people. You know, obviously, this is a very tight control that he has over his government. His son, Kim Jong-il, who's known by them as a fairly exalted figure. I didn't meet him. I don't think anyone outside meets him very often. But I think that the society is obviously dominated by reverence for these two men.
You think that the sanctions that were being discussed, and still are, but are in abeyance,
yes,
could have led North Korea to war?
Oh, yes, I don't think there's anything doubt about it.
If your mission had not been a success, what could you have done, or could anyone have done, to head off the sanctions?
I don't know what would have happened. I don't think there's ever been any assurance that China would have voted for the sanctions. And whether they would have abstained and permitted the sanctions to be approved without their vote is obviously something that we probably will never know now. I think the Chinese understand North Korea better than any outside society. And I think they realize, at least some of the things that I felt, that an insult or condemnation or economic punishment of North Korea would be counterproductive and might lead to conflict. So I don't know what would have happened if things had been different.
Let me ask you this final question as we part here. What do you say to those who suggest that having former presidents globe-trotting to hotspots confuses the policy enunciations of the United States and makes it appear that the line between the former president as a private citizen and a former president as a spokesman for the United States government has blurred?
Well, I think that's a misconception quite often in the minds of the press and the public. I've been president, as you may remember. I know what the proprieties are. I know what the laws are. And whenever I meet with any foreign leader, it's with a clear and repetitive reminder that I come strictly as a professor, as a leader of the Carter Center, unofficial in nature.
You appear to be speaking for the government.
But they understand that I don't. It may appear to you that I am, but it doesn't necessarily appear to them. There have been a few rare instances when I've been asked by the White House to carry a message officially and always make clear to the leader, on this occasion I want to deliver you a message from the White House or the State Department. Now let's abandon that. I'm now speaking as a private citizen.
Okay, private citizen, former President Jimmy Carter, thank you very much for spending time with us today. We appreciate your readout on your trip to Korea.
Thank you.
And Wolf Blitzer and I will be back. We will have conversations or discussions with White House correspondent Jill Doherty and Mike Chinoy, who accompanied former President Carter to North Korea, right after this.
Trail.
Wednesday to become one of the highest-ranking Americans ever to visit North Korea. His discussion centered on North Korea's nuclear program. The West fears the North is taking plutonium from its nuclear power plant to make bombs. North Korea denies it, but has refused full access to international monitors that could verify the claim. And the IAEA says the North has removed fuel rods from the reactor, effectively destroying evidence of any past plutonium diversion. Some analysts believe the North Koreans are determined to build the bomb to secure themselves against what they see is an increasingly hostile world. Others believe the North Koreans are only using the membership in the International Atomic Energy Agency on Monday, and the U.S. drew up a draft United Nations sanctions resolution against North Korea. The distance between North Korea and the United States seemed a chasm.
At this point, it is entirely up to North Korea to defuse the situation.
The solution entirely depends on the United States.
Into the Gulf stepped Jimmy Carter.
I would like to take this opportunity to pass to the Korean People's Army and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, President Carter, his wife, and their party for your safekeeping.
He walked across the demilitarized zone on nuclear issue as a bargaining chip in gaining full diplomatic recognition from the United States. CNN's Mike Chinoy covered Mr. Carter's visit.
If there's a lesson, and President Carter said this explicitly in his statement to CNN, it is that talking to the North Koreans, giving them respect, treating them on an equal footing may be the way to prompt them to offer the concessions that President Clinton and the rest of the international community is looking for on the nuclear question.
North Korea gave Mr. Carter an extraordinarily warm welcome. He spent 3 hours Thursday with President Kim Il-sung and was treated to a sightseeing tour of a capital showing no preparations for...
Former President Jimmy Carter appeared to get North Korea, as well as the international community, to step back from the brink of war this week. But not everyone is waiting to see if all the talk on ending the standoff over North Korea's nuclear ambitions brings action. CNN's Joe Oliver reports.
Early in the week, the tension reached a peak as South Korea held air raid and civil defense drills. North Korea withdrew its war. Mr. Carter was invited back on Friday for a rare second session. That meeting took place on President Kim's private yacht. The North appeared eager to discuss the nuclear issue, and the Clinton administration suddenly found itself engaging in what appeared to be televised diplomacy. On Thursday, Mr. Carter announced the North wanted a resumption of high-level talks with the United States and that it had backed down from a threat to kick out Western nuclear inspectors.
He's given me assurance that as long as this good faith effort is going on between the United States and North Korea, that the